Chapter 15. The Traitors. Standard Oil can be considered an enemy national in view of its relationships with IG Farben after the United States and Germany had become active enemies. Federal Judge Charles Clark, September 22, 1947. War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. Major General Smedley Butler, August 8, 1935. At the onset of World War II, the CFR established study groups to produce reports on specific foreign policy topics. The preparation of these reports did not represent idle academic exercises, but rather the means to advance the agenda of the CFR inner core. Admiral Chester Ward, another former council member, wrote, "Once the ruling members of the CFR have decided that the U.S. government should adopt a particular policy, the very substantial research facilities of CFR are put to work to develop arguments, intellectual and emotional, to support the new policy, and to confound and discredit, intellectually and politically, any opposition." Indeed, the studies generated by the Council have resulted in the establishment of such international institutions as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Financing for the study groups comes from the Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford Foundations, which are governed by boards of directors that are interconnected. The board members of the Rockefeller Foundation often pop up as trustees of the Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford Foundations, and vice versa. For example, CFR President John W. Davis served as a trustee for the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations, while running for president in a campaign heavily funded by Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the bank in which Paul Warburg, the founder of the Federal Reserve, was a partner. By 1960, many of the trustees of America's three leading foundations were executives from Bechtel Construction, Chase Manhattan, Kimberly-Clark, Monsanto Chemical, and other leading international business and banking firms. 12 of the 15 Rockefeller Foundation trustees, 10 of the 15 Ford Foundation trustees, and 10 of the 14 Carnegie Foundation trustees were members of the CFR. The established pattern. A pattern developed that would continue into the second decade of the 21st century. Corporate plans for expansion into new regions of the world were established by America's leading CEOs, many of whom served on the boards of major foundations. The foundations would fund CFR study groups that would inevitably uphold the soundness of the expansion plans and reports that were passed on to the State Department for implementation. Thanks also to the reports of the study groups, the interests of America became synonymous with the interests of the Rockefellers and the money cartel. Regarding the Rockefeller stranglehold on the U.S. State Department, columnist I.F. Stone writes, "The policy of the State Department is born in the offices of Standard Oil. From there it is transmitted to the Department of Defense, where the heads of the Army and Navy approve it. When this policy gets to the State Department, it becomes the policy of the government and is supposed to be confirmed by Congress quickly and without any changes whatever. When an order for laws designed to protect the interest of the oil kings comes from the Rockefeller dynasty itself, the entire Congress, from the small to the great, comes to attention and does what the bosses order it to do." The Chemical Company. Interesse an Gemeinschaft Farbenindustrie, the world's largest chemical company, had been created by a $30 million loan from Rockefeller's National City Bank. German bankers on the Farben Aufsichtsrat, the supervisory board of directors, included the Hamburg banker Max Warburg, whose brother Paul Warburg was a founder of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. Not coincidentally, in 1928, Paul Warburg became a director of American I.G. Farben's industry wholly owned U.S. subsidiary, whose holdings came to include the Bayer Company, General Aniline Works, Agfa Ansco, and Winthrop Chemical Company. From the time of its creation, Farben entered into joint projects with Standard Oil, including the construction of experimental facilities in Bayway, New Jersey, Baytown, Texas, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. By 1933, the German chemical company had become so wealthy that it could fund the Nazi Party's rise to power. The ties to Hitler greatly increased the chemical company's worth. By 1943, I.G. Farben was the leading producer of Zyklon B gas, which was used in the concentration camps. A delicate situation. Other Rockefeller firms came to aid the Third Reich, including the Paris office of the Chase Bank. An examination of the correspondence between Chase, New York, and Chase, France, from the date of the fall of France to May 1942, discloses that the manager of the Paris office was very vigorous in enforcing restrictions against Jewish property, even going so far as to refuse to release funds belonging to Jews in anticipation that a decree with retroactive provisions prohibiting such release might be published in the near future by the occupying authorities. The New York office manager, upon receiving this information, took no direct steps to initiate the dismissal of his Paris counterpart, since it might react against our Chase interests, as we are dealing not with a theory, but with a situation. Nelson goes south. In 1941, Nelson, according to Emanuel Josephson, dictated to FDR his appointment as Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, an agency created to promote Pan-Americanism. Nelson's first act was to obtain from Congress $6 billion to use at his discretion, with no accounts rendered. With cash in hand, he approached the leaders of various Latin American countries with a tidy offer. They could receive a portion of the money for defense if they were willing to come up with deals of interest to Standard Oil. The strategy was highly successful, and while the Second World War raged in Europe and the Pacific, Nelson managed to create for himself a Latin American duchy on the backs of U.S. taxpayers. By the war's end, the Rockefeller holdings south of the border included the International Petroleum Company of Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela, the Panama Transport Company, Standard Oil Company of Brazil, Esso Productora de Petróleo of Argentina, Esso Refinadora de Petróleo of Argentina, Esso Sociedad Anónima Petrolera Argentina, Esso Standard Oil Company of Chile, Esso Standard Oil Company of Uruguay, Esso Standard Oil Company of Cuba, Esso Standard Oil of Puerto Rico, Esso Standard Oil of Lesser Antilles and the Guianas, Esso Standard Oil Company of Bermuda, the Bahamas, and Greater Antilles, Esso Standard Oil of Central America, and Standard Oil of the Canal Zone. In 1943, President Medina Angarita demanded an increase of the government share of the oil extracted from Venezuela by Standard Oil. He also charged the Rockefeller Oil Company with the theft of $20 million by means of the false registry of the oil capacity of its tankers. A settlement reportedly was made in the amount of $9 million, and the indictment was quashed. But Angarita's political goose was cooked. He was immediately confronted with a populist revolution and driven from office. The oh-so-social society. In addition to serving as the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, Nelson also accepted a position as a director for the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the wartime intelligence agency that had been established under the command of General William Wild Bill Donovan. Staff positions within the OSS were reserved for members of wealthy American families, and the organization became known as the Oh-So-Social Society. In addition to Nelson, the directors came to include Henry Sturgis Morgan, son of J.P. Morgan, Jr., Nicholas Roosevelt, Paul Mellon, son of Andrew Mellon, David Bruce, Andrew Mellon's son-in-law, members of the Vanderbilt, Carnegie, DuPont, and Ryan families, and Allen Dulles. Dulles was a Princeton graduate and the senior partner at the Wall Street firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, which represented the Rockefeller Empire and other mammoth trusts, corporations, and cartels. He was also a board member of the J. Henry Schroeder Bank, with offices in Wall Street, London, Zurich, and Hamburg, and a principal of the Bank of New York. Wild Bill Donovan was an Ivy League lawyer who had married Ruth Ramsey, the heiress of one of the richest families in America. Donovan justified the practice of recruiting the socially elite for the OSS by saying, "You can hire a second-story man and make him a better second-story man. But if you hire a lawyer or an investment banker or a professor, you have something else besides." The birth of the drug trade. Another principal player in the OSS was Paul E. Hellawell, who remains a forgotten figure, despite the fact that few individuals have played a greater role in shaping the modern world. Hellawell was a well-heeled lawyer from Brooklyn. His father had been a prominent textile designer, and he was a good fit for the intelligence organization. While serving as the OSS Chief of Special Intelligence in the Yunnan province of China, Hellawell observed that General Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Kuomintang, KMT, sold opium to Chinese addicts in order to raise funds for his army's planned war against the communist forces of Mao Zedong. Since his task was to provide covert assistance to the KMT, what better help could Hellawell provide than steady shipments of opiates for the good general? He received General Donovan's approval to set up a fleet of surplus planes, including C-47 Dakotas and C-46 Commandos, to provide a steady supply of refined opium to General Chiang. The fleet, which became known as Civil Air Transport, transported weapons to a contingency force of the KMT in Burma. The empty planes were then loaded with drugs for their return trip to China. The pilots who flew these Bush-type aircraft were a motley group of men, who often served as agents or go-betweens with the Chinese national guerrillas and the opium buyers. Some were ex-Nazis, others part of the band of expatriates who emerge in countries following any war. Hellawell and his compatriots had created a model for the trafficking in drugs that would result in the formation of Air America. Because of his efforts, Burma's Shan Plateau would emerge from a relatively minor poppy-cultivating area into the largest opium-producing region of the world. The World Commerce Corporation. In 1945, Nelson participated with Donovan in the creation of the World Commerce Corporation, WCC. The primary function of the WCC was to buy and sell surplus U.S. weapons and munitions to foreign underworld groups, including the Kuomintang, KMT, the Nationalist Army under Chiang Kai-shek, and the Italian Mafia. In exchange for the arms, the KMT provided the opium required to create the post-war intelligence agency. Registered in Panama, the firm employed mob figure Sonny Fasoulas, a notorious drug dealer, to provide services to General Chiang. John McCloy, another WCC director, was intricately tied to the Rockefeller family. McCloy was a director of the Rockefeller law firm Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy, the Rockefeller Bank Chase Manhattan, and the CFR. Other members of prominent banking families served as WCC directors, including Charles Jocelyn Hambro of the Hambros Bank.